Welcome to Soltron. I'm going to do a little bit of customizing today. So I just got this Cyclonus. I definitely want to put maybe a peg at the end of the gun here so that it can peg into his arm. I don't know why, I just think that'll look cool. So I'm going to use this Lego peg to do that, this axle. And then I really don't like this head sculpt at all, so I want to rearrange the horns more like the IDW style. And then I want to drill out the cheeks so it looks more like that skull face. So the first thing we do is we just unscrew the head. It's got one screw in the back here. And then I already wedged the sides of the head open with a hobby knife. The head's held together by these little pegs here. I think one of them was glued in place, so that prevented it from opening, so I had to basically cut that peg, and then the horn will just come right out. And then for the faceplate, that's going to be pretty easy to drill. I'm going to use the smallest drill bit I have, just drill the cheeks and then maybe widen the holes in the side with a hobby knife. And then my plan for the horns is just to cut them in half and basically just reorient them to the front of the helmet, which I think will look more cool, instead of being on the side like bunny ears, which always bugged me. So I really enjoy this figure, and I think this will be a lot cooler. I would just buy the upgrade kit, but it's really expensive. Okay, this is going to be pretty precision work, so I definitely want to get a little bit above his mouth here. Okay, I think I'm going to have to do this off camera. Okay, so this side looking pretty good. I put that hole about where I want it. This side, I definitely did not get it in the same spot that I did on this side, so that's going to be a real problem. So I'm going to do what I can to even these out and make them look nicer. Okay, so this is what this looks like now. I use this hobby knife and I carved this out, and I carved these little channels under his eyes, which turned out pretty well. But it's definitely asymmetrical. I think this side turned out pretty good. It's a nice straight line, but this side, I definitely made an additional dent right here. So I'm going to try a little bit of super glue in there and maybe just dripping a little bit of baking soda and try to repair this gap right here on the side of his face. So I want to fill that in about right there. And then hopefully I can just paint up all these little scratches and things that I accidentally scratched on the face. I'll just paint all the jaw here silver as well. Okay, so I used this knife and I put a drop of glue on the gap, and then I just dusted it with some baking soda so that it looks like it's filling up the gap pretty well. So I'm just going to recarve it a little bit and probably use a little bit more filler to fill it out just a little bit more to even out both sides. Okay, so that patchwork's looking a lot better. I'm going to let this dry for a little bit, and while I let that dry, I'm going to cut these horns in half and figure out how to affix them to the top of his head. Okay, and cutting the horns was really easy. I just used the hobby knife and just cut right there. So I'm just going to use a Dremel bit and just clean off all this extra plastic here. Okay, change of plan. So I was looking at how these horns fit, and I do kind of like them, but his horns in the comic design have like an angle to them, and these are just kind of straight up and down, so these kind of don't work, and I don't want to have to cut these in half and fold them in half to make the angle. But I do have some Lego parts that kind of look similar, so this kind of has that angle to it where it's coming out, and that kind of looks okay. I like the way that looks. But I also have these Lego parts, which I think will work really well to have that horned helmet look. And then I'll just sharpen up this part where it's kind of rounded off at the edge to make them more pointed. So I think that these are going to be the horns I'm going to use. So I just need to cut these and then sand off the tips a little bit, make these a little narrower and more horn-like. And I think these are actually going to be really good horns for him. Okay, so here are the two horns. I machined it a little bit. So this one I sanded down the sides, make it a little bit thinner. This one I haven't done anything to yet, so I'm going to sand this one down And then I think these are going to look pretty good for this guy. Okay, now the horns are the shape I want, but they're a little rough, so I'm going to go over it with some rough sandpaper and then with some smoother sandpaper to get out all these rough edges. Okay, so here's how he looks now. I cleaned up his cheek, so that gap filled in pretty nicely. I still need to repaint these little scratches and that glue right there, but the horns turned out pretty nicely. I'm just going to reassemble his head and make sure everything fits in his chest cavity, and he can still transform. Okay, so the test fitting went pretty well. The horns do pretty much fit here, and he can still transform. So I'm going to use this polyplastic. I'm going to melt some of this down, and that's what I'm going to use to embed the horns on the top of his head. Okay, while that plastic's microwaving, I'm going to use this cutting disc and cut the end off of this. Okay, that's been cut off, so now I'm going to cut a channel in here so I can embed this peg. Okay, so that fits on there. I'm just going to glue this axle in here. It doesn't really need anything fancy. I'm a little bit dissatisfied with the way the horns are sitting in, so I'm actually going to trim the side of this crest a little bit and narrow it down so the horns can be more forward facing. And I'm just going to use a hobby knife to cut that plastic. Okay, the horns have been put in place with the polyplastic. This one's a little bit loose, so I'm going to use some baking soda and super glue and make sure that that one's sitting nicely in there. And this one could probably use a little bit of glue too to make sure it doesn't fall out. But I think he's looking a lot better right now. Okay, so I'm still waiting for the super glue on this peg to dry because to make it fit in here more snugly. So while I'm doing that, I'm going to go ahead and paint his horns and his face and replace the silver paint that I chipped off. Okay, I really like Tamiya is my favorite kind of paint, so I'm going to use that and just this basic round brush, and I'm just going to fill in all those spots. And one reason I really like Tamiya is because it has this plastic cap, so even if it's gummed up, you can usually get these off without using any tools. Alright, so here he is all finished up. I think this head sculpt is a lot better than his original head sculpt. And then his gun can kind of fit on the end of his arm. I thought it was a good idea at the time. I don't know. I think it looks decent. It's kind of pointless. And then I also had one of these swords just laying around, so I think this will be a good fit for his character. So I think that makes him look pretty complete right there. Alright, I'll see you next time.